Arts and Planning Division of the American Planning Association. And I'll be your moderator for today. Joining me on the back end is also Angela, and also I think Anis will be joining us as well, who are also part of the division to help us with the tech components of this webinar. And I also just want to take a moment to thank Jen Kaplan, who unfortunately couldn't be here today, but she actually organized this whole thing. So just want to acknowledge her and the amazing work she did to pulling this panel together. And like I said, we'll be recording today, so we'll be sharing the recording with anybody that can't make it for this, or actually wants to go back and listen again and watch the presentation. So we'll move forward. I'm just going to do a bit of introductions for the panelists, and then we'll jump into a presentation from the panelists, and then we'll go into a discussion, and it'll be time for Q&A near the end. So we'll give people an option. If you have questions as they come up throughout the presentation, feel free to put them in the chat as we go through it, and then we'll get to them as we move through the conversation at the second half of the event. So with that, we're going to have Bridget Marquis, is the director of Reimagining the Civic Commons, a national initiative transforming public places to foster engagement, equity, environmental sustainability, and economic development in cities. She manages the National Civic Commons Learning Network, housed at U3 Advisors, providing coordinated learning, impact assessment, and storytelling across 10 U.S. communities. Prior to leading Reimagining the Civic Commons, Bridget served as program director during the startup phase of Our Place America, where she developed and executed grant-making strategies to inform and accelerate the field of creative placemaking. She is a frequent speaker and author of Reimagining Public Spaces as Critical Civic Infrastructure for Equitable and Resilient Cities. Nate Storring is also joining us, and he is the co-executive director for Public Spaces, a nonprofit dedicated to creating community-powered public spaces around the world. As a nonprofit professional, researcher, and writer, he has spent his career investigating and sharing participatory approaches to city building. He has authored and edited a wide variety of publications, from a career-spanning collection of Jane Jacobs' short writings titled Vital Little Plans, to practical guides on inclusive placemaking, transportation on Main Street, and innovation districts. His latest edited book, Hyperlocal: Place Governance in a Fragmented World, explores the past, present, and future of how American cities managed their public realm. And up next, we also have Kelly Himrak-Hauser. I'm hoping I'm still got that right. Okay, thanks. Director of Government Relations at Main Street America, whose work is to uplift the role of Main Street organizations to policy and decision makers. She works alongside MSA's state, city, and country coordinating programs in defending and growing their programs and support MSA's network of Main Street programs and advocating for federal support for Main Streets. Prior to serving as Director of Government Relations, Kelly was the Manager of Education in Illinois Main Street Coordinating Program. In this role, Kelly managed the Main Street America Institute and coordinated training, technical service, and communications for the Illinois Main Street program. Before joining MSA in 2016, Kelly worked at the School of Art Institute of Chicago. From Northeast Ohio, Kelly holds a BA in Art History from Kenyon College, an MS in Historic Preservation from SAIC, and an MPA in Public Policy from the O'Neill School at Indiana University. So welcome all three panelists, and I'm going to turn it over to, I think, Nate, who's sharing the presentation, and then I'm not sure who's talking first.
I'll go first. Yeah. Good afternoon. Thank you, Patricia. It's great to be here. So I am Bridget Marquis. I am one of the conveners of the Percent for Place Coalition, which is a network of local, state, and national nonprofit organizations working to increase federal funding for civic infrastructure. So we're going to dig into Percent for Place in just a moment, but first wanted to just do a little introductions of ourselves and our everyday work. So Nate, I'm going to have you go to the next slide. So along with serving as a co-convener for Percent for Place, I also serve as the director of Reimagining the Civic Commons, which is a national initiative that's demonstrating that strategic investments in public spaces can connect people of all backgrounds, cultivate trust, and create more resilient communities. Next slide. This initiative is really built on the belief that many of the pressing challenges we face in our nation are connected to and manifest in our shared public realm. So for instance, trends from over the past 60 years show that the US is in the grips of increased economic segregation, social isolation, and distrust. So there's a few stats on the screen. We're more segregated by income than ever before, with the proportion of American families living in predominantly low income or predominantly affluent neighborhoods has more than doubled since 1970. And we also don't know even those who live closest to us. So in the US, a full third of us don't interact with our neighbors at all. And meanwhile, trust in all institutions across the globe is in decline, and so is our trust in each other. So a recent Pew survey found that 64% of US residents believe trust among fellow Americans is declining, and that this lack of trust makes it difficult to solve problems that require broad-based cooperation, right? So problems like climate change, like racial inequality, like a democracy under fire, all these issues are much harder to solve when you don't have trust in one another, nor in institutions. Next slide. So while these trends that worsen social isolation, tribalism, and distrust have grown over the years, our gathering places, right? Parks, libraries, trails, neighborhood main streets, community centers, the very places that could bring us together, have often been overlooked and suffer from disinvestment. They've been seen as nice to have, but not essential. And when budget cuts hit, they're often the first on the chopping block. So for the most part, our civic infrastructure isn't really being strategically considered as a portfolio of assets, but generally seen as liabilities on the balance sheets of communities. It's often being operated in silos, disconnected, without a shared common purpose, nor a sense of its true collective potential. So as a nation, we've basically allowed our civic commons or our civic infrastructure to erode. But what would a community look like that was putting every single one of its assets to work to connect people of all backgrounds, cultivate trust, and create resilient cities? That's the question of Reimagining Civic Commons. Next slide, which is a collaboration of the Freedom Together, Knight, Kresge, and William Penn Foundations, working alongside local partners to demonstrate the multifaceted value of investing in our shared civic infrastructure. We launched nationally in 2016, and the initiative has now grown to 10 cities that participate in a robust community of practice. The infographic on the screen sort of distills the Reimagining Civic Commons model. It's one that elevates a portfolio approach to civic assets, which you will see kind of mimicked in Percent for Places, thinking of it as a system, paired with this outcomes orientation and a commitment to collaboration in order to deliver a more engaged, resilient, and welcoming city through your public realm. So I'm going to wrap up on that slide and pass it over to my fellow Percent for Place co-convener, Kelly.
Thanks, Bridget. Hi, I'm Kelly Hummerkhauser, and as was mentioned, I work at Main Street America. I hope to just spend a couple of minutes giving you a little bit of details about Main Street America if you've never heard of us. Nate, go ahead. So here are our mission and vision statements. Always want to start with that stuff, but I'll give you a little bit more background so you can check those out. We work with neighborhood commercial corridors and rural Main Street programs across the country. We started 45 years ago, as an effort from the National Trust for Historic Preservation to reinvest in places that were deteriorating, particularly in rural areas when we started. And it was really based around kind of physical environment and the concepts of historic preservation as they could be deployed in those rural downtowns. But over time, we've really grown. Our local programs are seen as part of the economic development ecosystem within their communities and are trusted partners to their local government in making improvements that help the community prosper citywide, not just in the downtown environment. So as of today, you could go to the next slide. We participate and represent and work with about 2,000 communities are kind of operating under this model nationwide. I think 1,200 that you would see here on this map where they're getting so clustered you couldn't tell the difference anyway, are a part of our kind of accredited community of Main Street programs. So we do have a process by where the local Main Street program, which typically operates as a 501c3, works with a statewide entity typically to then become kind of certified in their approach to downtown redevelopment. We do have some that function as city government, and we have those statewide programs in 42 states, but we also operate specific programs in big city, such as the city of Boston, where Bridget lives, or Washington, D.C. Over 80 miles of Washington, D.C. city streets are part of their citywide Main Street program. So in each of those areas, next slide, Nate, we have a local community-based organization operating what we call the Main Street approach. And it's really a methodology and organizing framework for having people work on the elements of their community that they want to improve, typically centralized around that commercial corridor or downtown area. So it used to be called the 4 points, and now we kind of recast it as the Main Street approach. We encourage all of our communities to kind of have a central strategy for the improvement of their community based on market dynamics and community input, and then to implement that strategy across economic concerns, design concerns within the area, promotion, trying to make the place somewhere that attracts consumers and residents, and organization. And really under that organization framework is where we kind of focus on kind of building the capacity of those organizations and also their capacity to advocate on behalf of themselves for their needs. And that's really where I try to do a lot of my work in government relations to have our programs participate in federal advocacy with us. So that's just a short cap about Main Street America. And if you're interested in learning more, we do have an upcoming conference in Philadelphia, April 7th to 9th. You can find all of us there. So I'll pass it over to Nate.
Awesome. Thanks, Kelly. So yeah, my name is Nate Storring. I'm one of 2 co-executive directors of Project for Public Spaces. And we're actually just a member of Percent for Place. So not a co-convener, but I'm going to tell you a little bit about our organization and also why we wanted to become a member of Percent for Place. So Project for Public Spaces, we're an international nonprofit organization dedicated to design and education around public space. We were founded in 1975, so that means that today, or this year, is our 50th anniversary. So we're really excited about that. We just celebrated that actually last week. And this is our mission, which is really based in the belief that great public spaces strengthen communities, right? They're the heart of so many aspects of our community well-being, as Bridget was so rightly pointing out. And as an organization, we really support communities in improving their public spaces through technical assistance, training, funding, and also convening. So we also have a conference coming up. This one is focused on markets. It's called the International Public Markets Conference, happening in Milwaukee this June. So if any of you have that interest, it'll be a great time. So what does that actually look like on the ground? Well, this is just an example of one project that we did recently in Atlanta, Georgia, where we were able to work with local stakeholders, again, much like Main Street America, working with like all sorts of different stakeholders within the community through a community engagement process we call placemaking, to improve this relatively drab plaza that hadn't seen a lot of improvements over the last few decades into a platform for the arts instead of just a pass-through space previously. So this is just one example of a project on the ground where we were really providing technical assistance, working with a local community organization to make this happen. Through this type of work, both that on-the-ground work, education, convenings, we've worked in over 3,500 communities around the world since we were founded in 1975. And we continue that work today. So as I mentioned, it's our 50th anniversary this year, and one of the ways that we decided to mark that occasion was actually doing a bit of a check-in survey with our constituents to get a feel for what were the biggest issues that people were facing in public space today. And I think this really gets at the value of Percent for Place and why we became a member. We already knew that some of these things were issues, but this really drove home some of the things that Percent for Place is really dedicated to addressing. So again, we had a really diverse and robust response to this survey from around the world and across the United States. And some of the key themes that rose up immediately were, number one, we're not doing so great. 95% of respondents said that they felt that public space was either failing to meet the needs of community or was doing okay, but definitely needed improvement. So that means only 5% said that public space is already meeting its full potential, right? So it's a really under-leveraged asset, again, as Bridget was saying. 51% said that capital or operational funding was one of the top practical issues facing public space today. So again, the majority of respondents felt that we really need to do a better job of investing in these spaces. And then lastly, and this is a little bit more nuanced, but 31% said bureaucracy or political will was one of the top practical issues facing public space today. And that gets down to basically how this funding shows up in communities. What are the strings attached, right? What are you allowed to use it for? What are you not allowed to use it for? How is it structured? What are the reporting requirements? What are the application requirements? Like all that stuff matters. and makes it much harder to access the funding that's necessary to do the work on the ground. And so that's another issue that Percent for Place is also engaged in. So that's a little bit about us, and I'll pass it back to, I believe, to Bridget.
Great. Thank you, Nate. So I mentioned at the top of the hour, Percent for Place is really this coalition of local, state, and national nonprofit organizations working together to increase federal funding for civic infrastructure. Go ahead to the next slide. So some of you may be asking, what exactly is civic infrastructure? So we have a definition. We define civic infrastructure as the interconnected system of public places that boost local economies, increase resiliency and trust, support health and well-being, create a more equitable society, and strengthen democracy for all. So it's our parks, our trails, our main streets, town squares, play spaces, libraries, recreation centers, and other public spaces. Next slide. And to clarify the coalition's efforts, we collectively generated this list of kind of what is in these places of gathering that are open to all and predominantly free versus what is out, which includes places that are not predominantly oriented as places of gathering, public gathering, and or places that regularly charge a fee or membership. So our definition is Percent for Place's definition. So there will be other ones that you find out there on the internet. But this definition is very clear. It is about the hard infrastructure of place, right? So we recognize that underlying a community civic infrastructure is a set of policies, programs, and people that work really in tandem to build and foster a sense of place. When we use the term civic infrastructure, we do mean hard infrastructure, partly because the focus of ours is on the federal government. And when they say infrastructure, they also mean the hard infrastructure. But despite that, we are also open to advocating for funding for civic infrastructure related to all aspects, right? Including capital design, programming, operations, and maintenance. We just don't want to get confused in terms of how it's being defined. Next slide. So we know that civic infrastructure provides many different benefits, right? So research has shown that high quality shared community assets, our shared civic infrastructure, provides benefits from supporting local economies to improving health to reducing crime and violence. And the connections across diversity that can be fostered in these spaces help spur prosperity and economic mobility. Not only that, but civic infrastructure is also a part of every community, right? It's urban and rural. It's this asset waiting to be leveraged all across our country. And as Nate mentioned from the survey that they did, it's clear that we aren't doing a great job leveraging it because we're not investing in it at a high level. And despite all these kinds of benefits, right, it's vastly underfunded. In 2020, a report by the Kinder Institute identified more than $12 billion in needed funding for high priority projects nationwide. There is really still very little existing regular federal funding for this form of infrastructure. So it's not something that's necessarily, there's not a Department of Civic Infrastructure in the United States. There is not sort of a key player at the federal level who feels like it's their responsibility to invest in this level of community infrastructure. Next slide. So we at Percent for Place advocate for a consistent, dedicated, small percentage of different federal agencies' budgets be reserved for investment in building and maintaining high quality civic infrastructure. Next slide. So this cross-sector coalition's goal is really to normalize and institutionalize the allocation of this percentage of federal spending for civic infrastructure for the benefit of all Americans and the communities in which they live. And we do believe that even a small percentage could create transformative change, providing this sort of reliable stream of funding for high quality shared community assets. Next slide. So what began as a group of 6 organizations in the spring of 2021, Percent for Place is now a broad coalition of nearly 30 organizations that are working to create this welcoming and robust civic infrastructure for all Americans and to really advocate for it at the federal level. And I just wanted to point out 3 key qualities of the coalition. So first, it's cross-silo, right? We have groups here that represent parks, trails, public spaces, main streets, community development, and housing. We can still add to that list. So if you're in transportation, don't be afraid to raise your hand. So would love to see even more of those kind of silos come into this table. Second, it's local and national. So we feel very strongly that we want to ensure that perspectives from people who are working on the ground in communities every day, as well as those operating across communities at the national level, are both represented. So Nate's survey is a great example of the value of having the voices of folks that are on the ground be able to communicate to us who might be working more nationally what the real challenges are with federal funding streams that currently exist, or what they might see as being the barriers to unlocking some of those resources. And third, it's both rural and urban, and I can include suburban too. We actually just have brought on a new member who represents Atlanta, both rural, suburban, and urban Atlanta. But we really recognize that there's a shared interest in strong civic infrastructure that exists in communities of all types and sizes, and that both rural and urban communities often face the most significant disinvestment. So I'm going to pass the slide show over to Kelly, who's going to share more about our governance structure and the policy work ahead.
Yeah. Thanks so much, Bridget. So as Bridget mentioned, she shared our specific purpose, and she shared how we've kind of grown from just a few members to kind of a broader structure. I want to tell you a little bit about how that structure is kind of both loose and adaptable and responsive based on what's happening in the day. So next slide, Nate. So generally, we kind of see this kind of core outward structure based on the participation of members, and it's really a choose your own adventure type of coalition, because we really do respond to people who want to get more involved versus those who might step back and find their moment at a different time. So Reimagining the Civic Commons and Main Street America serve as the co-conveners of the coalition, but we really have welcomed that broad group and appreciated the work of individuals and organizations who step up to form that red rapid response team. So really we're on like constant email chain, and sometimes that's in specific kind of task groups based on things that the coalition decides that it needs to do. And so we try to have kind of a regular conversation. Bridget and I end up on many calls in a week together, and then we'll be on constant email change following the federal appropriations process or following a specific document that we're trying to produce to make sure that we're doing that. And we have a once monthly call that's open to anybody who's a participant in the coalition, where we kind of bring some of those items together. And still, we even have a broader group of folks that are on an email chain, maybe are getting our updates, but aren't necessarily always engaged. So it's really, like I said, we have this kind of community of practice formed for the purpose of advocacy for civic infrastructure. It's really flexible. Some people have come back after they've changed jobs, which is wonderful to see. And it's also a place where if you have a specific interest and you can come in and have some conversation around that, or ask the group for something that you need, we support one another. But I'm going to also talk a little bit, next slide, about how we are moving into the murky waters of the future. I'm kind of preparing for this. We were all kind of talking about also, the changing nature of our current moment and how advocacy, specifically at the federal level, is moving in different ways every day. So right now, Nate, next slide, please. Our goal is, Bridget said our overall goal around increasing funding for federal funding for civic infrastructure. The way that we have organized our work to do that, to improve civic infrastructure as a federal priority, is through storytelling, which is something that we have been doing from the start, but we are always hoping to continue and increase doing. Coalition building, which is the nature of us having a call like this and talking to you all about what we do. And then federal policy strategy, which is, again, kind of a murky area in this moment in the world. But we do have our kind of sites in front of us with a little initial seed funding to support the coalition from JP Morgan Chase. We are trying to advance this in a way that allows us to expand our reach going forward. So we are a full-fledged coalition, which may soon have more resources for you to dig into. So next slide, please. Talking a little bit about, again, that policy agenda at the federal level. this has been a really interesting time for policy agenda development. The climate we're in is constantly changing. So I think we are both trying to stay true to that initial need that this coalition formed for, which was looking specifically at federal streams of funding and increasing those, but also taking a look at this moment in a different way that is about the creativity that one finds even in crisis, right? And thinking about the fact that if the government is rapidly changing right now, how can we think about our objectives in a creative way that helps us look at a brighter future that may come in a moment of change? So next slide. Our current kind of organized policy priorities would be around near-term tactics. What can we do in the near future under current administrative functions with current forms of civic infrastructure funding that exist at the federal level, and then long-term future vision, what can we do? So we can talk more about existing federal funding streams. That's going to maybe be part of our conversation, but we hope that Congress will continue to invest in civic infrastructure through one of the biggest ways that it has over the past 3-4 years since the earmarks process came back. One of the biggest ways that we've seen civic infrastructure created is by communities making requests to their members of Congress for earmarks, which are now called congressionally directed spending or community project funding. We've reviewed those, we've done stories about those. We believe that that is the source that people are going to because they're allowed to specifically say what exactly they need. Another big funding opportunity that is currently under a bit of threat is the Community Development Block Grant Program. Several of our members also participate in the Community Development Block Grant Coalition, and CDBG is a reliable source of funding for folks to invest in community priorities, which often happen to be civic infrastructure. So maintaining funding in this current environment is a need. There's no certainty or backstop for existing programs. So we are trying to maintain that focus while also thinking about how we move forward into a new vision for a governance structure for civic infrastructure that removes silos and regulatory barriers, that allows us to invest in that systems approach to civic infrastructure, where it's not kind of piece by piece under different federal programs, and how we could think about a federal investment ecosystem that prioritize civic infrastructure projects and systems at the local level. Why don't we have more of a focus on that from the federal level when that is what creates such wonderful outcomes in our communities? It's a question that we can ask and try to create conversation around for sure. So with that, we'll go to our final slide in the deck, which is just an invitation. We'll have discussion here, but we also want to make sure that you know that you are welcome to join us. If you are interested in participating in the coalition, Bridget and I generally have a song and dance to onboard new members, but we also are happy to take any interested names and emails just to make sure that you're on our list for future communications when we send out pieces. And as we advance the coalition more, we'd love to keep you informed about what we're up to.
Awesome. Thank you, everyone. I really appreciate the presentation. I feel way more informed about what Percent for Place does. And to me, it's really exciting. I also want to acknowledge what Kelly started her part of the conversation with about this sort of uncertainty that we're dealing with now with our federal government, and understanding that this is really kind of structured towards a federal sort of advocacy strategies with this work, and sort of acknowledging that many of our colleagues out in the field are getting impacted in that in a lot of different ways. And so I'll just say, as from the Arts and Planning Division, who strongly believe that arts and culture are part of developing strong, vibrant communities. It's part of the reason why our division exists. And the whole reason, one of the main reasons that we started sort of this conversation with presenting this work to our members and to all of you that are attending today. Just acknowledging when we started this conversation, the world and the country was very different. So we had to adapt what the questions were and things that we were going to sort of frame this conversation around as we kind of move forward. But we still felt it was really important. And because we had such a very high turnout with our registration, so we're very thankful for everyone that showed up today and has registered. Within that, I'm going to ask some questions that are more about sort of advocacy and sort of strategy sort of development. At the same time, we also would love to hear from you guys. We have, there's only, I think, about 30 or so participants at the moment, so feel free to raise your hands, or you can, if you want to, feel free to drop a question in the chat. I'll do my best to sort of manage both, but feel free to raise your hands as well, and I'll keep an eye out for you if you have questions. So I'll start off with some questions, but if there's some folks that have other thoughts that they want to share as well, feel free to raise your hand or drop them in the chat. So the first question, which Kelly already started to talk about, but I'm going to kind of approach it anyway to see if there's anything else that either Nate or Bridget might want to add. In light of the current federal landscape, how has Percent for Place adapted to its advocacy strategies? What approaches have been most effective that you've seen at this moment?
I'll jump in, and then I hope Kelly and Nate, you will correct me and make additions. So one thing that we've started talking about in recent months, and that we plan to launch, I think, in the next 24 hours, is this collection tool to collect stories of impact of federal funding freezes or department cuts on local civic infrastructure efforts on the ground in communities across the country. So one thing that we are hearing is that when you actually go and have conversations with individual members in Congress, is that having those very specific stories of this funding stream being cut has made these 5 jobs no longer in my community, has resulted in this project not moving forward, has resulted in whatever it is, the kind of tangible stories of negative impact on the ground are really helpful in order to impart the impact that is happening in specific districts with members of Congress. So that's one thing that we're doing that we'll be launching very shortly, and hope that you all will submit how it's impacting your work on the ground and possibly share with your networks, because we think this is something that's happening across the country and people are getting impacted in different ways. But we really need to be able to tell very coherent stories of that impact with as much sort of detail as possible in order to get that into the hands of folks in the legislation.
Kelly or Nate, do you want to?
Kelly, you've got more on this than I do, for sure.
Well, I'll just say, you know, a lot of I've seen some organizations struggling, and frankly, I'm perfectly clear. I think my like a national organization, a national nonprofit right now, is trying to figure out what to do just as much as any other person, you know, just as much as our legislators are, because things are changing really fast. But that's also the name of the game, and the strategy from the Trump administration is to make everything happen really fast and to put people on their heels and to make them disagree a little bit. So I don't mean to sound partisan at all, but it is kind of pretty much a well-known strategy, you know, for the administration to do as much as possible, as fast as possible, to move their agenda as much as possible. And so part of it is also kind of staying the course to make sure that you are not giving up on long-term objectives and sacrificing that in order to make to react to everything that's happening, because it's almost impossible to even keep up with all the executive orders for a lot of folks who are paid professionally to do so. So it's I just say that part of the approach has also been, part of the approach I've seen from many organizations has been to make sure that regular processes are followed, so that we're not well, you didn't follow the regular process for funding for this because you were responding so much to another move by the administration that you are no longer eligible for that, right? So you have to make sure you also stay on course.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. And just to build on that for a moment, you know, we're again, 50th anniversary. So we're actually in the process of doing some strategic planning right now. And you might look at the current sort of situation around funding for public space and uncertainty and sort of say, well, wait, I mean, don't you need to be like rapidly responding to everything that's going on? And we are doing some of that, but we're also going to continue doing the strategic planning. And the strategic planning is really thinking about that 5-year horizon of, like, I think, Bridget, you were saying this, like, what do we build now to change, to be creative in the moment as well, and think about what is the world that we want to have, and particularly as it pertains to our public realm, and how do we change that 95% number so that it's flipped on its head, so that public space is achieving community outcomes? Like, we're still keeping that long-term perspective, even though things feel very uncertain in the moment.
Yeah, I appreciate that. Thank you, all three of you. The idea of sort of keeping the focus on the long term while also understanding that there's a lot of things kind of getting thrown at us at a moment, figuring out what to adapt. I remember my time back in the day when I was in the DMV during the first term of Trump, and just how like much it's a fire hose coming at you, and trying to figure out where do you kind of turn and pivot for the moment. And this idea of being creative and how do we rethink, imagine the world, and we kind of have this moment sort of, and how do you take advantage of that? So I appreciate that. So the next question I'm going to jump to is around everyone's favorite topic, which is of course funding. What types of federal funding have historically supported civic infrastructure projects, and how do you see these funding streams evolving in the current climate?
It's so fun. I created a chart so that we could have, so Nate, if you want to go to the next slide, we did a group storytelling report last year at some point to just talk about the different existing federal funding streams for civic infrastructure that people are finding them on. And what we were trying to communicate, I think also as part of the presentation, is you can get civic infrastructure investment in a lot of places, but you can only get a little bit of it and only for one portion of your civic infrastructure system at the local level. So one little piece at a time from one of these many, many buckets where you have to follow all the rules and go through the whole process for that bucket, and then go to a different bucket so you can do the trail portion of your downtown planning project. But no, the park and the library are going to be built separately. So that's kind of at the core of our thought process around this, is that there's many different places where you can have that investment, but none of them give you the maximum impact for what you need to improve your community in a systemic way. I could highlight, we could almost pick off the bat any of these funding streams right now and talk about what the threat is. And it comes basically in two forms at this moment. One is the staffing changes. Rapid reduction in staffing at federal agencies means that not all of the projects that there is funding for the money will go out. It's one way to kind of slow down, work on the ground for projects like this, is just don't have the staff there to respond to the emails from the folks who have received the dollars already. The second threat is, of course, in the appropriations process. So, we talk about CDBG a lot as a critical source for civic infrastructure. When Trump came into office in his first budget year being 2017, in his first presidency, CDBG was entirely cut from his budget proposal. We anticipate that will be the circumstance again. We are preparing that we would need to make sure to fight for that existing flow of funding. And really, mayors were critical at that time to making sure that CDBG was retained in the budget. Department of Transportation, we could look at that list of programs, and there's two concurrent things going on. Surface transportation reauthorization is on the table for the coming year, which means that a lot of those programs that started in the bipartisan infrastructure law, which was like a 5-year law, would need to get reauthorized. But concurrently, administration priorities change how dollars can flow. And the administration just this week, the Department of Transportation announced that it would be reviewing all money going out for projects that are green infrastructure, bike and ped infrastructure, and trying to make sure that none of those are out of alignment with Trump executive orders. So there is a possibility for the reduction in the use of some of those programs for their intended purpose because of this order. And of course, there'll probably be some challenges to that, right? So this is just a kind of a cap about the fact that there are possibilities for civic infrastructure in many places, but unfortunately, none of them is comprehensive. The last thing that I would say on this is that one of the other things that we're looking at as a coalition is American Rescue Plan Act state and local fiscal relief dollars. Many of you may have seen those at work in communities that you have worked in over the past 5 years. That money came out in 2020-ish and is due to be kind of completed spending in 2026. So now's a good time to say, how was that money spent? And we have some wonderful students at Berkeley who are doing an analysis of when local governments have a choice about how to spend money, what do they prioritize? When their citizens are involved in making the choice, what do they prioritize and why? So we're doing that research right now. From the early look of it, it looks like folks choose civic infrastructure. Can't say it categorically yet, but we really like what we're seeing in terms of the number that, you know, it's more often than not that if the citizens in the community have a choice in this, it's to do things that make their community better. So we should see more of that from the federal government overall.
Great, thank you, Kelly. I don't know if Nate or Bridget, you have anything you want to add, or?
Kelly covered it all.
And yeah.
Awesome, thank you. And feel free to, if anybody has any questions, feel free to raise your hand or unmute, or you can drop them in the chat box, of course, as well. So again, going back to you know, the current context that we're in, what are the most strategic ways for planners and stakeholders to engage with your coalition? Are there specific approaches you're recommending during times of political transition or uncertainty that we're facing now?
I'll jump in on this. And then Nate, I hope you'll jump in as sort of a member of the coalition. So I would say, first off, like, you are welcome to join as a member of Percent for Place. There is no fee to join. It's literally this coalition for advocates who really care about civic infrastructure. And as I mentioned, it's meant to be for people who are working at the local level, as well as people working at the national level, and all levels in between, right? Regions and states. I think that joining together across these kind of disciplines and communities can be a very powerful way to sort of amplify the voices and the very diverse set of voices who want to see the US invest differently, right? Including these investments in civic infrastructure. And in this moment, I guess in my day job with Reimagine Civic Commons, I manage this national network, right? So I mentioned there's 10 communities that participate in this community of practice that we host. And one thing that we heard from them and continue to hear from them in this moment, but heard a lot from them during the pandemic, was that these types of sort of diverse national networks are super powerful when we have this kind of lack of information or a need to sort of problem solve for issues that none of us have direct experience with from our past, right? So it's sort of like, it feels very early in pandemic days to me in terms of just, there's a lack of information. There's a lot of stuff coming at us at once. You're not really certain exactly what is reality, right? And what's true. And you don't have a way to respond because you've never faced the exact situation that you're facing. And so I do think in terms of that and that support structure, obviously Percent for Place primarily meets once a month virtually, but is also this ongoing stream of information. So Kelly mentioned some of the folks that are on more of the rapid response teams. You know, there's an email chain going regularly. And if that's something that you really want to tap into, you certainly could, right? And so I think it's just a really, in this moment, having these types of networks that are working across different fields and across different communities can be valuable in their own right as coalitions, because they just are a good way to transfer knowledge and information in places that sometimes can be hard to juggle. So that would be my thoughts on the coalition. But Nate, I would love for you to chime in.
Yeah. So, I mean, I think from our perspective, what you just said about the network just being a source of information in a time where you really need that on the ground information, I feel like is absolutely right. It gives us a lot of value in that way. You know, as an organization, we work a lot with these sort of stewards of civic infrastructure on the ground. And so we're often actually not the ones applying for federal funding. We don't have a government affairs person. So we're not as connected into some of the things that the network is really about. And so I learned a ton being a part of the network and just hearing how people are engaging with these different things. What are the ins and outs of how they get funded and all of that? Because it has a sort of second order effect on our work on the ground. So I think it provides a lot of value in that way. And then in terms of, you know, how to get involved, of course, we attend the calls on a monthly basis, but what we're trying to do, again, as I said, we don't have a government affairs staffer. So, but what we can help with is the storytelling. we have a fairly large national audience. And so we're trying to find more ways to engage on that front. We helped put together the survey that Bridget mentioned earlier that's going to help gather some stories about how the funding cuts are affecting people on the ground. And we're actually hoping to share some of those stories more publicly as well, to help our audience understand like what's really happening through these funding cuts. So yeah, I think there are a lot of different ways to get involved, even if you're not an organization that's directly connected to this world of federal funding and decision making.
Great, thank you, Nate and Bridget. And I want to acknowledge that Charlotte has her, is it Charlotte? Has her hand raised, so feel free to jump in, unmute and jump into the conversation.
All right, thank you very much. I love this conversation and being here, so thank you for this. I think two questions I have. One is just about the name of the kind of collective, Percent for Place. As someone who has a background in public art, I'm an urban planner as well. I was like, is this kind of talking about similar to Percent for Art, and the percentage that a lot of cities pay into for public art? So is that how we came up with this term, Percent for Place, which I find very fascinating? That's my first question. You want to talk about that first, and then I can ask my second.
So I can jump in, and Kelly, I feel like you were part of these early conversations too. So yes, we definitely we were trying to think about, okay, there's this system of civic infrastructure, right? Civic infrastructure is not exactly a sexy name. And so like, that's probably not what you want to put into your headline. And it's all really about place, right? So it's like place is a very important thing that I think a lot of people can tap into. It's a very open term that feels very accessible. And yes, the Percent for Art work was kind of the borrow in terms of, we really do think if we got 1% of the federal budget to go into civic infrastructure, that would be enormous. I mean, it would blow out of the water what we're spending now from a federal budget perspective. And so just 1%, right? 1 percentage point. And so, yes, we definitely realize that people are familiar with Percent for Art. I think it's a very common kind of campaign that exists and policy that exists in different communities. And so what if you applied that same type of thinking to civic infrastructure and place writ large, and thought about it at the federal level as opposed to just at like the city or local level?
Yeah, that's exciting. Thank you. I do happen to think infrastructure is a sexy thing, so forgive me for that. And then my second question is just how you go about finding the appropriate partnerships or ability to work with others in the coalition. Santa Fe is a very unique space, and it's not necessarily it's not a big city. It's not necessarily rural, but we do qualify for some rural funding. And there's a very our public space, our plaza is in this big, huge issue over a monument that's in our public space, and how we're going to navigate that. It's been going on for over maybe a couple years now, but how do you go about, because I would love to be more involved in understanding how we can reimagine some of our public spaces, but how do you go about assessing the best kind of way to do that with interested parties?
Maybe I'll jump in there. So that's a lot of what Project for Public Spaces does in our day job, sort of apart from the coalition. Mm-hmm. And so, a lot of what we do is the sort of develop the community engagement process for bringing together the right stakeholders to have that conversation about, particularly, as you said, the vision for the public space, starting there, and then backing into some of the sort of elements that Kelly was talking about, actually, the sort of different, the design, yes, of course, but also the programming, also the organizational elements that are required to care for the space. So that's sort of how we typically operate. And I think, the coalition is really that sort of broader systems level of like, we can do that, but then at the end of the day, how do you pay for that work? And how do you pay for the actual improvements themselves? And are there, known pathways to that? Or do you have to kind of cobble it together every time? And that's one of the problems that we see all the time in our work is everyone's always trying to figure out, how do you piece together public and private funding from all these different streams with different strings attached. So that's the sort of bigger challenge we're trying to solve together.
Okay. Well, thank you very much for answering, and I look forward to continuing the conversation and being a part of it.
Thank you, Charlotte, for speaking up. I appreciate it. And I just want to acknowledge the folks in the chat who are also want to be part of this conversation. So if there's any sort of like, whatever the best way is for us to get that information to you guys at the end, we can collect, I guess, email addresses if you want, and send it to you at the end of the conversation. So if folks want to share that, we'll be collecting that as the organizers of the event and sending that to the Percent for Place folks. So thank you for that. Yeah, and I have another question. So just kind of keep this going, which I'm really excited about this question, just hear what you have to say. But what lessons have been learned about building bipartisan support for placemaking initiatives that it might be particularly relevant to today's polarizing environment? Kelly, is this you or
Who wants to start?
or who wants to start?
I think we talked about taking a team approach to this question. So I'll kick it off briefly, but I think Nate has an instructive story, if I remember correctly, as well. So, you know, my organization, Main Street America, is a national organization, and if you remember the map from the beginning, we exist in a lot of rural areas. Our work is predominantly in rural areas, and that does have some equivalency to conservative areas. And so, you know, as opposed to, I think, some other national nonprofit organizations, we have a stronger reach into rural areas of the country. And I hope that's kind of a massive generalization, but in this place-based work, sometimes it's seen as a democratic issue, or something that Democrats get on board with more. And I think what we can do is share that representation across into rural spaces is a pretty important thing to do. So that's been very, since the beginning of the coalition, Bridget, in recruitment efforts, has always made a really strong case for making sure that we have strong rural representation, because that is a side that needs to be bought in sometimes. And I think the other thing is kind of keeping your claim and keeping your argument localized. You know, we can make a lot of arguments for why civic infrastructure has great local outcomes, and at the end of the day, any local government that, you know, prioritizes investment in places that bring health, economic prosperity, lower rates of poverty, that all increases the bottom line. And I once read a book that says everything a local government does is economic development. Like, you know, so when we're creating that, making the case for that and keeping it in that language, it's particularly helpful to make it stay a kind of central and nonpartisan issue.
I'm going to jump in, and Nate, I know you're going to jump in too. But just to hang one more kind of shingle on what Kelly just said. So with Reimagining Civic Commons, we had a studio gathering in Philadelphia in the fall. And one of our speakers was Senator Chris Murphy. And he had been spending a lot of time over the last 2 years really trying to unpack the loneliness epidemic and like what is government's role in social connection, right? So he's a U.S. Senator from Connecticut. And one thing that we asked him about during that conversation was like, what's the right language for this, right? And one of the things he pointed out was that in his work and in this focus on kind of loneliness and social connection, 2 of his colleagues at the Senate that came up to him without prompting were both Republicans, and he's a Democrat, right? So he was like, this is a bipartisan issue, right? This is not it's not because I'm a Democrat that I care about this. Like, this is coming up in a lot of people's districts, and they want to be thinking about it. And so we asked him about the language, and he said, like, language like local, authentic places, the common good, right? These like this unifying language is really valuable in terms of making the case. So if we think about sort of the bipartisanship of this work, along with Kelly's point of like local economy is also a very strong, I think, positive, connotated word or a phrase to be using across different political parties. But I just really appreciated his sort of elaboration on thinking about how you could define civic infrastructure in ways that really resonate across political persuasions.
Even the word civic is also a sort of somewhat calculated choice of using that term to describe this, rather than, because social infrastructure is also a sort of related term, but civic is a word that resonates a little bit more across the political spectrum, right? But still also gets at the heart of what it's all about. So yeah, I mean, the thing that came to mind when I saw this question was the sort of long history of the NEA, the National Endowment for the Arts, and the sort of culture wars stuff that was going on with the NEA and going back to the 80s, and the way that it very much changed the way it funds art significantly, right? Back in that time when it was very controversial, like there was a lot of funding that would go to specific art projects, and that created these situations. There was one piece in particular called Piss Christ, which you might guess why that might have been controversial, that were blown up into this whole culture war around the National Endowment for the Arts, the idea of defunding it and so on, right? There was a large shift, right, in the sort of 2010s, I would say, where there was this growth of this idea of creative placemaking, and the NEA really refocused a lot of its efforts, or at least a good chunk of its efforts, to focusing on creative placemaking and ensuring that these projects, number one, involve the whole community, right, and often happen within the civic infrastructure of these communities. So they're out in public, they're engaging everyone, right? They often have more than just the visual aspect to it. There's programming aspects, all of that. And they also are spread across the country, right? And they made a real effort to make sure that there was funding going to every nook and cranny of the country. And so what ended up happening with that was that in 2016, when Donald Trump was elected the first time around, again, there was a focus on cutting funding to some of these agencies, and the NEA immediately comes up as easy pickings, right? That we're going to say that's the one that's going to go. What ended up happening was Mike Huckabee, so Republican governor, wrote an op-ed defending the National Endowment for the Arts. And what the argument was some of the exact same things that Bridget and Kelly were saying, which is like he saw the value of these grants in his communities, and the fact that it was really supporting real people, and it was visible, and it was impactful, right, across the spectrum of communities that he served. And he really made the argument for keeping the NEA. And after that, that effort kind of dwindled, and the NEA was not completely defunded and dismantled under that first administration. So, who knows what's going to happen, but I do think it's instructive that shift in focus to ensuring that the whole community is involved, and that the funding gets to all different kinds of communities, urban, suburban, and rural, made a difference in terms of being able to make the case for this type of federal funding.
Yeah, I really appreciate that, you guys. I love that idea of like keeping it focused on local when you have the conversations with folks, because that's really where people can really kind of make a decision and make choices, and have a lot more control about when they're talking with their decision makers and other politicians. That idea about, having this conversation around economic drive, everything's economic, and if you build it right. And I love your story around the NEA, and I agree with you, that shift that it made. And it's probably one of the only agencies, I believe, that actually can argue it's part of every congressional district. It's actually made funding choices, which also helps part of its sort of advocacy components federally. So I really appreciate that. I think this sort of information about like how we talk about this from that kind of local level up and moving forward. I had Brittany who had her hand raised, so I want to give her a chance. And James, I just saw you raise your hand, but Brittany, I had you raise your hand first. So hop on. Yeah.
Thank you, Patricia. My question is about how to kind of building off of that example of the loneliness epidemic and arts and placemaking as being such a solution to some of that work. I wonder if you could comment on any trends around policy or funding that have come through the Human and Health Services Department. Yeah, that's my question. Thank you.
So I can only speak for myself. I'm not an expert in HHS areas at all, really. So funny, because my colleague Michael is. and he's not on today. But I'd say, we saw a huge reaction in the coalition to the Surgeon General's report on loneliness and social isolation last year. And it's really kind of one of those things that there are existing funding streams through HHS, CDC, WalkWorks is a big one that has helped some communities kind of form plans to become less socially isolated and more, health and healthier. I think it's a very changing tide at this moment, and I think it also has to do with how that might get picked up and utilized by the current administration. So I don't have a really good, strong answer there, unfortunately, but I know somebody who you can talk to if we want to have that kind of dialogue more. Michael, who's on my team, has a public health background in addition to doing this work in urban planning. So he's a pretty good resource on it, and I'm happy to set you up with a conversation if it's something you want to dig into more.
Thank you, Kelly. Bridget or Nate, do you want to have anything to? Okay, say no. So James, go right ahead. Hop on. Feel free to unmute yourself. Yeah.
Hi, my name is James Rojas, and I kind of occupy the space between placemaking and urban planning. And it's these two different worlds that exist. Urban planning is by law, zoning, regulations, and there's a ton of money in urban planning. These plans cost thousands of dollars. But placemaking, which is more about people, doesn't have that kind of funding or support. So I guess the issue is, how do we make urban plan? We have this tool, urban planning, that just has a lot of, power, but yet we're not really we need to tweak that to be more place making focused. I think what happens is that planning is all very transactional. It's always about highest and best use. It's always about real estate developments. What do you want to see in this vacant lot, TOD or via retail? And it's all very cut and dry. And it's not about people at all. So, but placemaking is about people, but yet there's no space in the planning world for that kind of discourse. If in fact we just did a pop, like the work we do, it's kind of gaining traction in urban planning world. But when you have people, when we facilitate workshops, people want relationships to spaces. They don't care about transactions. They never say, I want 100 units of affordable housing next door to me. They know, I want to talk to my neighbors. I want to be part of this street. I want to be physically active in my neighborhood. But the planning world doesn't even look at that at all as part of a planning option. So I guess we should really think about, how do we change the planning outcomes so they're more based on relationships, and less about transactions. It's just the nature of the U.S. We've always been a very transactional country. Without, every planner starts a meeting and says, "What's the highest and best use here?" And they never ask, "What's the connection? What's the relationship to this land or the people around you?" So I guess that's why we get these really we might get the land use right for a project, but we get the feeling wrong. Like Los Angeles Unified School District built a lot of schools back in the 90s in Los Angeles, but they all feel like prisons. So we really need to really integrate more placemaking in the actual planning process and really start to, have billable hours, really kind of get into that world, because that's where that world just churns all the time. And it's just always constantly churning by law, by growth. So we need to be part of that world. And if we'll have a lot more, we'll have better cities. Yeah, that's my comment. Thanks.
Amen, James.
So I want to just add an example where I think they are headed in the right direction on that front. So through Civic Commons, this is my Civic Commons hat. Through Reimagining Civic Commons, one of the cities that is part of our network and has been part of it since 2016 is Detroit. And the city of Detroit's planning department, after its bankruptcy, they rebuilt themselves in a very different way. And they hired actually a lot of folks that might not have had planning degrees. They do have planners. However, many of them are landscape architects or other types of designers, etc. And the person who now leads the new planning director for the city of Detroit is Alexa Bush, who has led Civic Commons efforts in Detroit for a number of years. And I think one of the things that she would say, I believe, shifted some of the work that they did through Civic Commons work was that they were very outcomes oriented. So we have 4 outcomes that we focus on, one of which is civic engagement, and that includes kind of building public life, building trust, etc. So that relationship building component. And that because we moved kind of what the outcomes were for the work in this one neighborhood in particular, that sort of the strategies by which you would actually deliver projects through the planning mechanism changed. And so I think there are good examples of folks who are doing innovative work through planning departments in the US that are, I think, shifting practice. So I would just say, like, that's a real highlight, I think, in terms of looking at places within the US that are doing it differently and are prioritizing trust, relationship building, etc., not just like highest and best use for this one plot of land.
Yeah, that's a good point. But that's just a really small percentage of all the planning that's done in the US. You know, LA, San Francisco, Oakland, there's like millions of dollars going to planning. And I think, you know, cities use their wealth and their real estate to really make this thing happen. So I think, you know, we could probably look at Detroit, but people, how do we get Oakland or San Francisco to take on that model? It's really hard. You know, I think Detroit was kind of at the bottom, so they were able to try anything new, but most cities are just going to keep the status quo. That's how we train our planners to think about spaces.
Yeah,
James,
I think.
oh, go ahead, Nate.
Sorry, I was just going to say, I think one of the problems around that bureaucracy number that we saw in our survey, and that relates to all of this, is just that we often let our tools and the way our organizations are sliced up dictate how we respond to things, right? And so zoning is a tool, and it's the tool we've decided to like go all in on. And so that's the thing that structures how we respond to things. And I think part of what Bridget's getting at is that by refocusing on outcomes, or similarly refocusing on a specific place, it challenges you to break down the tools and the organization into and rework it around that common goal or that common focus. And we do need to just find more ways to systematize that. And it's the same when you look at this funding, it's the same problem, right? Where it's just like, you have to go into every single bureaucracy in order to build one integrated place instead of having a more streamlined approach that centers the end product, you know?
I'm just going to add on, James, just because I know you are going to be in attendance at the Main Street Now conference. Thank you very much. That one of the other areas you kind of were mentioning bigger cities, you know, and how do we kind of break down these urban planning structures. One of the challenges that main streets are facing, especially in our rural areas, that 75% of them have a state highway running through their downtown, and they're unable to retain kind of any sort of control over that in relationship with state departments of transportation, who have really structured, you know, through STIPs and through their existing kind of bureaucratic methodologies, aren't necessarily adaptable to the input of a local group saying that we just want to do this placemaking project on a state highway in our downtown, right? So I think it's a kind of a similar challenge to what you're saying. But again, I agree with what Nate's saying, kind of having networks and localized power and the ability to have groups be able to give that input and kind of say what's best for the community is one way that we're kind of trying to break down those silos. And a few state DOTs are responsive to that, but it's just, I think nationally we see that problem as impacting main streets pretty strongly.
Yeah, I really appreciate this conversation and sort of the way sort of James sort of framed it around there's these structures in place that we seem to lean into, particularly as agencies sort of move through it between laws and regulations and the tools that sort of Nate mentioned. In my opinion, more from cities being very risk averse, so they probably lean into things that most likely work. And I'll just sort of add from my perspective, sort of a bit of an outside from an allied feel from the arts and culture world. It's fascinating to watch the planning world sort of poke at how to, kind of James's point, like utilizing creative placemaking strategies and sort of creativity to kind of address things. And you see this very wide variety of the way people do it from like these very in-depth way of doing things and really be community-centered the way James does, and I've seen the work that he produces in his team, all the way to people who are just sort of like, let's put a mural here and make it pretty. which is part of it, but there's like a process to it. It's not just about the product, right? That sort of conversation. So I appreciate that. I don't know if anybody else has any questions. I'm not seeing any. Again, I'm just seeing sort of folks sort of point out that they really want to get involved in the chat. That's what I'm sort of seeing at the moment. I don't know if anybody else has any questions. Feel free to raise your hand. Or I also want to open it to the panel. Is there anything you wish you had a chance to say that didn't really come up, or something you just want to add to kind of lean on, let people kind of, yeah. Oh, I see. Also see one of our presenters, sorry, one of our attendees sort of raising their hand. So Abby, I can open it to you, and then I'll give Bridget, Kelly, and Nate like a minute if they want to say something sort of like as sort of a wrap up as we get sort of near the end of our event. So yeah, Abby, go right ahead.
Great, thank you. Hey everyone. I know that a lot of this conversation has been around lack and scarcity and, oh no, we don't know what's happening. But where do we think there are opportunities? So either where is there federal funding? Where is there hope? Where are there champions? How might we need to shift the story of what civic infrastructure is to actually work in what we have now?
Who wants to take that?
I mean, to me, that goes back to the long game, right? Of just because things are the way they are now, that doesn't mean we can't imagine a better future and have that 5-year horizon and start building towards that now, and trying to figure out like, well, if things aren't the way we want them to be now, what do we need to do to get there, right? If we just respond to every little thing that is happening now and every big thing that's happening right now, we're not going to get there. And so I think we have to do some of that, and we have to pick our battles, but we also have to build a better future. And so that's a big part of it. I also do think, this is not the purview of Percent for Place per se, but I do think that the philanthropic and corporate community is shifting rapidly as well. And some of them are choosing to fill in gaps that are left by federal agencies. Some of them are sticking to their guns. Some of them are pulling back. And so that's another place to kind of keep an eye out for how the landscape is shifting. And there may be some large opportunities that arise from that, but they're not going to be enough to truly fill that gap, to be totally honest. The federal government is a huge funder, and no amount of philanthropy is going to get back up to that place, I think. So anyway, sorry to end on a down note, but let's build a better future. There you go.
And I would add to that, like thinking about being a place of abundance, right, as opposed to a place of scarcity. And I think there's a few things I would say. One, there are certainly opportunities for this type of resourcing to happen at local and state levels to be reconsidered, right? So, Percent for Place obviously is focused on federal, but that moniker could also apply to a state budget, right? So I would say that's one additional place to look. And then I think there is a real opportunity during this period of upheaval where people are becoming more civically activated. And so I see this, it's not a resource in terms of a monetary resource, but I think it's a human resource, a capital that we need to recognize and say, okay, can we actually activate towards a better end? And what does that look like? I actually think in terms of advocacy, we're going to see more and more people getting more activated into things that maybe they never even thought that was something they could do, right? Or didn't ever get the invitation to really be part of the activation or the activating their kind of civicness. And so I would say that is kind of a resource that I think we need to lean into in terms of just more people coming into this realm of advocating for better communities, better nation, etc. So that's something that I think we can't ignore, is the human capital side that, again, I think people are being very activated. And the question for that, the question becomes to do what, right? Where are there opportunities for them to actually be productive in that activation? So that would be my add But Kelly, you probably have a great answer.
Well, I mean, I think James had a great answer in the chat. It's community engagement, and I'll just uplift that. And my format of saying that is also that something we talked about in prep for this, and what Bridget was just saying too, is like it's we have to get people not to just if you see a form that comes out that says sign on now, you will save this funding stream. Sure, you can sign it, but unless you actually schedule a meeting and show up at your congressman's office with a story about how that project has actually impacted you, or at least pick up the phone, right? Like we need people to do real, actual things in advocacy and not just kind of clicktivism. And that happens through strong networks, and it happens through community engagement, and it happens through kind of collective action. So I just, we gotta do the real authentic actions to get our real authentic places.
Can I say something?
Yeah.
So I think the reason I say community engagement is because, I've done the 2,000 workshops all over the country, and the outcomes are always wonderful because I have people start with their favorite child memory, understanding place, as and as that place of joy, and so they're happy, and when they work with their hands, when they build that memory, it's all about their senses and what their body wants, what their mind wants, what their heart wants, what their body feels. Therefore, they build a city of caring and nurturing. They never build parking lots, highways, big box developments, none of the typical stuff people always talk about. In fact, whenever we start our work, whenever we work for cities, the planners always tell us, well, this person's going to want more parking, this one's going to want more desk density, all the same stuff, right? But since we don't use language, we use art making, it changes the whole outcome. The people are happy, and when people are happy, they're open-minded. When they're using their hands, it's their body talking, not their language. Because people if you ask people what they want, they'll just say more parking and less traffic and low density automatically. So why even ask them? Because you're going to get the same response. That's what DOTs do. Okay, build more highways. But when you use the different form of engagement, you get a whole different outcome. And I think that's where we need to make the change, is that we need to do better engagement that changes outcomes. And then, because then people they see this project or this plan as their healing, and they'll be activated to move forward on this. Because now I need to do this because this is going to make me feel better in my neighborhood. So I need to plant more trees, or plant flowers, or do something, because they see it and they see it as a win. And plus, because they work in collaboration, they inspire each other. So just that bare, grassroots level can really change things, because then they'll become the advocates. Just changing the question we ask and how we ask it.
Yeah, I just want to elevate that. I think that's absolutely right, James. And in our work, I think there's two sort of avenues for improving engagement that we use a lot. One is observation, so inviting people to actually go out in the space, giving them tools to help guide their observations, see it themselves, analyze what's going on, and come up with ideas for improvement. And then also imagination, which I know that you do some incredible work around, is giving tools for play and inspiration that help get people, like break people beyond their sort of everyday life and thinking aspirationally, seeing what else is happening in other places, all of that kind of work to just kind of like you said, get out of the rote question or the rote answers that we're all thinking about in our day-to-day life. But I think that's great advice.
Yeah, this is really fantastic, and thank you for bringing up the concept of community engagement. I also want to acknowledge Brittany's conversation in the chat about corporate funding opportunities, and Dan's questions around mutual aid or solidarity equivalent conversations and the crowdfunding gaps. And I'm so happy, Nate, you brought up patronicity. I'm completely obsessed with the work they've been doing with the state of Vermont in that work that they've been doing, I think, now for 3 or 4 years, and really kind of building a different way to fund and support the larger conversation of placemaking, but creativity, of course, falls into that. So I'm so glad you brought that up as well, in sort of different options that state levels as well as local levels have to kind of do their kind of work. So we're kind of itching towards the end here. I think I'm trying to catch all the comments as they're coming in, and to sort of also acknowledge Brittany's example around Save Cambridge and their block party permits and the micro grants that they're doing as well. But I want to kind of give the panel one last chance to see if there's anything they want to share, just from their own perspective, or just like maybe a question we wish we asked, or just sort of like a last sort of moments that they want to share with everybody before we wrap up. Bridget, do you want me to start with you, or somebody else wants to?
Sure. I haven't given a lot of thought to my closing statement. I would just say that I encourage you all, obviously, to get involved in Percent for Place if civic infrastructure is your jam and you feel like you want to both learn more and or contribute to an advocacy effort. I think it's we would love to have you participate. And then secondly, even if that isn't your jam or this isn't your jam, I would say, I would highly encourage you to stay engaged in some network that's happening, that you can stay connected to people that are working. And maybe it's this, Arts and Planning Division network, but I do think those networks are going to be very valuable in the coming months and years ahead. And that I just encourage you to stay active, because I think that will be very important for our communities and for our nation.
Cool, thank you. Kelly or Nate, who wants to go next? Kelly?
Same. My last word was really the last thing that I said about, getting out there and advocating in an authentic way. I think it just makes all the difference in the world when I speak to Main Streeters all the time, and it's like, write down all your members of Congress, write down their phone numbers, call the staff, ask for a meeting, show them this place improvement that you've made. Right. So whether you are a consultant on a project, working with a community group, like, you guys can do this together and make the case for it, and just starting the conversation with a member of Congress and saying, hey, listen, funding for programs like these is important to members of our community, and it's created this impact. Anybody can do that. Anybody here can do that.
Yeah. I will share in the chat, if you want to stay in touch with the Project for Public Spaces, this is our website. We do have a bi-weekly newsletter that, again, if you're just like interested in these issues and trying to figure out how to stay on top of it, how to get engaged in a variety of ways, we collect news, we collect opportunities, we have our own opportunities, so that's a good way to stay in touch. We will be sharing, if there's any kind of news coming out of Percent for Place, it will be in that newsletter. But also, I would say, just to build on what Bridget and Kelly were saying, like, starting local matters, thinking long-term matters, and taking action now matters. And so I think if we can do those things, we can keep moving things forward. But don't forget about any of them. we got to do all three, right? And I think the national landscape is going to continue to evolve, but those are the places where we do have some control. So let's take control of those things.
Awesome. Well, thank you, everyone. I put it in the chat, but thank you, Bridget, for the encouragement. If people want to sign up for our newsletter and stay connected with the Arts and Planning Division, American Planning Association, the link is in the chat. Feel free to join. We'd love to have you. We're always sort of sending out information and trying to figure out what our next professional development opportunities are for all of you. And thank you, of course, to all of our panelists for joining, your lovely insights, and just the work that you're doing. Thank you so much, particularly during this challenging time that we're all in the midst of. And of course, thank you to all of you for presenting, as well as all of our participants for attending, Abby, Brittany, James, and Sherelle for your questions, and everyone that engaged in the chat. So thank you, everybody. Like I said at the beginning, and I'll just repeat it, all the registrants will get the recording of this so you can watch it or share it with your friends and colleagues as we move forward. But thank you, everybody.